Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining the global launch of our new report, Freedom of the Net 2025. My name is Gerardo Berthin, and I serve as president of Freedom House alongside Annie Boyajian, who's traveling today and sends her best wishes. For those of you less familiar with our work, Freedom House is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on advancing and defending freedom globally. We were founded in 1941 to mobilize the US public against Nazi Germany and the threat to our collective security and universal values. For decades, we've sounded the alarm on rising authoritarianism through our research and analysis. We have worked with policymakers across the political spectrum to tackle threats to freedom in the United States and around the world. And we have provided life-saving support to the brave frontline defenders leading the charge for democracy and human rights in some of the world's most repressive environments. Today, we come together to explore the challenges and opportunities facing the world's digital landscape. The internet remains one of humanity's most powerful tools for free expression, civic participation, and accountability. But the same technologies that connect us are being weaponized to silence dissent, manipulate information, and engage in traveling surveillance. Freedom of the Net is our annual assessment of internet freedom. The simple notion that the same rights that apply offline should also apply in an ever digitalized world. Shortly, we will hear from three of our exceptional technology and democracy experts, Grant Baker, Kian Vesteinsson, and Jennifer Brody. You will then hear insights from our expert panel. We have some fantastic guests joining us. With the time remaining, we will turn to audience questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit any question that you have, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can also join the discussion on social media using the hashtag #FreedomOnTheNet. Let me close by thanking Grant, Kian, and Jennifer for the tremendous work, as well as Catherine Brody, Amy Slipowitz, and Ali Funk, who all made invaluable contributions to our global research. I would also like to thank all of Freedom House supporters. You all made this work possible, and we thank you for your contribution towards our vision of a world where all are free. I'll now turn to Grant to start our presentation. Grant, please take it away.
Thanks so much for the intro, Gerardo, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. So I want to echo Gerardo's words of appreciation to the Freedom House team, our partners and supporters, and to the larger internet freedom community. Today, we'll discuss our research approach, key findings, and policy recommendations. With that, let's dive in. So as Gerardo said, internet freedom is the simple notion that the same rights we have offline should also be protected online. Our Freedom on the Net process takes about 11 months. This year, it combined desk research and consultations with independent experts. We analyzed internet freedom in 72 countries, which covers about 89% of the world's internet users. Could we move to the next slide, please? For each country, we assess how easily people can access the internet, whether the internet is censored, and how fundamental rights such as free expression and privacy are restricted or protected. We're examining the real-world experiences of people in a given country. We are not solely evaluating a government's performance. And as a note, the coverage period for this report was June 2024 through May 2025. So here's what we found. Global internet freedom declined for the 15th consecutive year during the coverage period. Of our 72 countries, 27 declined and 17 improved. The rest did not have an overall score change. The biggest decline took place in Kenya, where the government carried out a violent crackdown on a nationwide protest movement in June 2024, shutting down the internet for the first time in the country's history. China and Myanmar shared the designation of the world's worst environment for internet freedom for the second consecutive year. On the other end of the spectrum, Iceland was the freest, followed by Estonia. Bangladesh earned the year's strongest improvement. A student-led uprising ousted the country's repressive leadership in August 2024, and the interim government made positive reforms in internet policy. In a concerning trend, conditions in democracy suffered. Half of the 18 countries ranked free by Freedom on the Net experienced score declines. Only 2 improved. People in Georgia experienced the most significant decline in the free cohort, followed by Germany and the United States. Georgia's ruling party enacted repressive measures targeting civil society and independent media outlets. In Germany, authorities pursued criminal prosecutions against people who criticized politicians. In the US, the online environment remained diverse and free, buoyed by protections offered by the US Constitution's First Amendment. However, growing restrictions on civic space threatened to stifle digital activism. Authorities detained several foreign nationals for 1 to 2 months for nonviolent online expression. And the country's communications and antitrust regulators carried out investigations that touched on forms of speech protected by the First Amendment. Additionally, we analyzed 15 years of Freedom on the Net data for insights into how digital repression has evolved. We also explored how the immediate future of internet freedom will be shaped by our response to new technologies, which my colleague Kian will turn to later. We found that control over online information has become an essential tool for authoritarian leaders seeking to entrench their regimes. The countries that saw the steepest 15-year declines included Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, and Venezuela. All were comparatively more open when Freedom on the Net analysis began in 2011. But authoritarian leaders worked to dominate their digital environments, imposing harsh controls in response to mass protests, political activism, or other challenges to their rule. Russia exemplifies these trends. The country saw the steepest 15-year score decline. President Vladimir Putin has attempted to carve out a sanitized domestic internet while crushing dissent. In the aftermath of the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, Russian authorities laid the groundwork for a sovereign internet. This technical and legal project aims to disconnect Russia from the global internet. Early restrictions were not always effective, leaving some space for opposition figures to organize and advocate online. So the Kremlin stepped up its efforts, developing new censorship technology and instituting increasingly repressive legal controls. By Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, the new censorship model was much more effective. The regime blocked access to international social media platforms, independent news outlets, and the websites of human rights organizations. During this coverage period, the government blocked encrypted messaging platforms like Signal and began disrupting access to the internet across the country. Blunt censorship measures and arrests for online speech have been integral to authoritarians' efforts to dominate the information space. But these regimes, and other more democratic regimes, have also turned to more subtle measures, such as the covert manipulation of online discussions. These efforts obfuscate their origin and misrepresent content as authentic and organic, undermining access to reliable information online. So Freedom on the Net tracks 21 indicators within the 3 buckets I mentioned earlier. The indicator that has declined the most across the project's history is the one that evaluates whether online sources of information are manipulated by the government or other powerful actors. I'll highlight 2 tactics that are increasingly common. 1, content manipulation campaigns use technical tricks to masquerade as trusted sources, mimicking the names, mastheads, and formats of established news sites. In October 2024, for instance, Singaporean researchers identified a shadowy network of news sites disguised as familiar outlets that were all reportedly registered to a little-known public relations agency. The sites posted news content that appeared to parrot Chinese state media, and the imitation news sites used in manipulation campaigns often mass-produce content with AI tools to create an illusion of depth and scale. Second, political parties and governments also rely on well-known social media influencers to help spread propaganda. Pro-government influencers paid through an opaque network of public relations firms have been integral to shaping public opinion in the Philippines, particularly during electoral periods. This year, pro-government influencers were a key factor in the rising feud between President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Vice President Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of former President Rodrigo. With that, I'll hand it off to my colleague Kian.
Thank you, Grant. Now, When the Freedom on the Net project was launched in 2011, there was widespread optimism about the power of information technology to support pro-democracy movements and drive progress for human rights. 15 years of Freedom on the Net analysis shows that the internet has also transformed how state authorities and other powerful actors assert control over information. This next wave of new technologies will transform how people exercise their rights in digital spaces. In our research, we zoomed in on three cutting-edge developments. First, government-backed AI projects. Second, the rise of satellite-based internet connectivity. And third, the use of mandatory age verification systems on the internet. The future of internet freedom will depend on how governments deploy incentives for and controls over this next wave of innovation. So we'll take them in order. First, we found that governments around the world are pursuing ambitious agendas for AI development. Policymakers worldwide have declared their pursuit of AI sovereignty, which is the idea that governments should retain significant control over AI systems and cloud computing infrastructure. However, the systems developed or deployed by repressive governments could amplify existing threats to freedom of expression and privacy. For example, AI models that are developed under tight government oversight might be required to incorporate the censorship of certain content, like criticism of government authorities. In June 2025, for example, the Russian and Belarusian governments launched a plan to develop AI built on, quote, fundamental and traditional values. This is the same justification that these regimes invoke when they're censoring criticism of their leaders. Now, democracies around the world have also invested in sovereign AI capabilities, usually in the name of economic opportunity and national security. As they seek to implement these plans, policymakers should work with the private sector and civil society to establish governance frameworks that protect free expression and privacy. Meanwhile, a growing sector of satellite-based internet service providers is creating a dramatic shift in how people get online. Innovation in the field has lowered the cost of satellite launches, enabling a new model in which providers can operate a constellation of many satellites from low Earth orbit. This offers wider reach and better connection quality compared to conventional satellite internet. Service providers like Starlink and Eutelsat are already connecting rural communities and people in areas affected by war or natural disasters, much as in Ukraine. However, these providers are facing increasing pressure to carry out censorship and surveillance. For example, Kazakhstan's government threatened to ban the import of satellite communications equipment back in December. Authorities in Kazakhstan only walked back those plans after signing an agreement that allows Starlink to enter the market in June of 2025. According to government officials, the company agreed to comply with Kazakhstan's information and communications laws, which have long enabled authorities to restrict access to the internet and spy on users. As the satellite internet market continues to grow, providers should prepare for further government pressure to carry out this sort of disproportionate censorship and hand over the data of their users. Finally, we found that an increasing number of the world's governments are placing constraints on online anonymity. In the world's most repressive regimes, authorities put laws in place that require people to verify their identities in order to post online content. For example, a Vietnamese law passed in December 2024 requires the users of social media platforms to authenticate their accounts using their government-issued identification cards. Rules like these present a serious risk of harm in countries where people face arrest and heavy criminal penalties for expressing certain views online, much as in Vietnam. In democracies around the world, separately, policymakers have imposed age verification laws in the name of online safety and child protection. Protecting children online is an important and essential policy aim. but measures that compel platforms to verify people's ages introduce a range of new risks. For example, implementation of the United Kingdom's Online Safety Act requires websites with broadly defined harmful content to implement age verification measures. The law has already resulted in notable examples of overbroad application, creating barriers for people in the UK seeking to access websites that feature information about LGBT+ issues, journalism, and even public health information. These measures also create new privacy risks. Cybersecurity breaches at companies that carry out age verification or provide third-party tools to do so could result in the leak of people's identity documents or sensitive biometric data. As we were finalizing the text of this report in early October, the platform Discord disclosed that a third-party vendor had been compromised, and this resulted in the breach of 70,000 identity documents that had been used for age verification purposes. So this risk is already present and in front of us. Policymakers should instead seek options that bridge child protection and fundamental rights, as Jen will outline in detail later. Now, I want to close on a forward-looking note. Earlier, Grant spoke about how a student-led movement in Bangladesh ousted a repressive leader and seeks to translate this momentum into long-term change. As the Bangladeshi people turn towards this important project, they might look toward the Gambia as a model. The Gambia recorded one of the strongest and most persistent improvements in internet freedom over 15 years of our report's coverage. After the 2017 ouster of the authoritarian ruler Yahya Jammeh, Gambians have implemented an agenda of reforms in internet policy, and the country's civil society has mobilized to support and safeguard these gains. From Bangladesh to the Gambia, these stories are an important reminder that it's possible to halt and recover from the 15 years of global decline. Reversing this trend will require collaboration among democratic governments, the private sector, and expert bodies. To dive into this further, I'll pass it to my colleague, Jen.
Thanks very much, Kian. So now we will be moving into policy recommendations. Freedom House and other members of the digital rights community have long offered clear, practical recommendations for protecting internet freedom. For one, government should maintain access to internet services, digital platforms, and anti-censorship technology, particularly during elections, protests, and periods of unrest or conflict. As for companies, they should mainstream end-to-end encryption in their products, support anonymity software, and resist government data requests that contravene international human rights standards or lack a valid judicial warrant. Companies should also minimize the collection of personal information, limit how third parties can access it, and ensure that people who use their services have control over their own information, including the right to access and delete their data. Sustained implementation of these principles remains essential to reversing and preventing global declines in internet freedom. So my colleagues have shared about how freedom and democracy will be shaped by the ways in which governments utilize, influence, and regulate new technologies. When backing AI development projects and building new AI systems to deliver public services, it is essential that governments conduct human rights impact assessments to ensure that AI systems do not curtail freedom of expression, privacy, and due process, among other human rights. Policymakers should also engage with civil society better to understand the promises and perils of AI tools before rolling them out, and then communicate with stakeholders about how any adverse impacts are being addressed. Meanwhile, satellite internet providers should anticipate and prepare for disproportionate government demands to conduct censorship and surveillance, as my colleague Kian previously alluded to. These companies stand to benefit from well-established mechanisms for multi-stakeholder collaboration around telecommunication services and human rights, such as the Global Network Initiative, which offers guidance around navigating these pressures. Finally, we should collectively pursue measures to protect children online that do not undermine privacy and security. In practice, this means that governments should avoid mandating that platforms implement age verification or age assurance systems. At the very least, they should be built with strict limits for third-party data sharing and the strongest possible cybersecurity measures. For platforms that allow children to make accounts, those accounts should automatically receive the strongest privacy settings and feature altered algorithmic recommendation systems that limit exposure to harmful content. Also, government should provide greater resources for investigations into online child abuse. So to wrap up, thank you all for joining. We've hit you with some of this year's highlights. You can read more on our website, where you can explore the essay, our full policy recommendations, summary of developments across 72 countries, and our amazing partners and generous donors. And with that, I'll hand it off to Adrian Shahbaz, Freedom House's Vice President for Research and Analysis, to start our panel discussion. Adrian, over to you.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everybody. I have the honor of introducing two of our esteemed guests for today's panel, and I'll invite them both to turn their cameras on and join us. First, I'll introduce Sabhanaz Rashid Diya, who is the founder and executive director of Tech Global Institute. She was previously head of public policy for Bangladesh at Meta, where she focused on issues such as data protection, the digital economy, hate speech, and AI. She's also worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, and the World Bank on a range of tech and governance issues, and also founded a youth engagement nonprofit. So that's two nonprofits that you founded, Diya, and also worked as a journalist for several years. Diya, thank you for joining us. I don't know where you find the time. Kat Duffy, thank you so much for joining us. Kat is a senior fellow for digital and cyberspace policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to joining CFR, she directed the task force for a trustworthy future web at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, where she also served as a resident senior fellow and published the task force's comprehensive report. She has worked on a variety of democracy and digital rights issues at the State Department and at Internews, and has advised companies, governments, and NGOs. Wow, a mouthful, both amazing bios. Thank you so much for joining us today. Diya and Kat are joined by Kian Vesteinsson, our senior research analyst for technology and democracy. Kian leads our Freedom on the Net project and was previously a senior law and tech policy officer at Human Rights Watch. Welcome back, Kian. So let me just start with an easy one. I wanted to maybe get a little bit personal here and just set the stakes for our conversation today, and especially for these listeners who are thinking about why does all of this matter? So I wondered, and perhaps Diya, we can start with you and then go to Kat and to Kian. Why do you think it's important to have a free and open internet? Why do these issues matter today?
Thanks, Adrian, and congratulations to Freedom House on the new launch. It's very exciting, particularly I think at a time now when we need these assessments and data more than ever, especially with as geopolitics gets more complicated, as our world gets more sort of interconnected, and everything is a lot more complex, and so we need a much more nuanced understanding of what's happening around us. So, huge props to Freedom House for getting it out this year as well. And really, I think it's interesting, because the world that we live in today, internet, and is such an integral part of it. Everything that we do is our online lives has such a dominant effect on our offline lives. So in that sort of a scenario, internet freedoms is more important than ever to preserve and protect. And so I think, and if I look at the last 15 years, from any time in history to now, the fact that we're also online, that and being online is not just a social issue or a technical issue. It's also as much a political issue. I think makes it even more critical that the stakes are very high, and to make sure that the internet remains open, uninterrupted, interoperable, and free. And the last part I was just going to say that I think, also because of the way the internet has been in the last couple of decades, I think we kind of saw the wave of 20 years of internet where it was structured in a very specific way. There was a multi-stakeholder model leading it was built on. But now I think more than ever, that model of how the internet was governed, how the internet was going to be operating, is changing quite a bit. There's an increased sort of pressure on trying to control the internet, whether within national borders or through the infrastructure or through at the content layer, as your report shows. So I think in a situation like this, where the very future of the internet and the future of how we think about communication, how we think about the fact that you and I are talking right now, is because the internet is interoperable and free. That is very much at stake. And so more than ever, I think we are not just fighting for our ability to be online, but also the fact that the very shape of the internet could be changed if you're not thinking very carefully and cautiously and very deliberately about internet freedoms.
Thank you, Diya. Rousing initial comment. Kat, over to you.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And again, congratulations to Freedom House. This is always such a lift, this report, and it's so important in the world and the space. It's our one consistent report on these issues over a decade and a half. And so truly congratulations to you all. I first of all, as ever, second to everything Diya says. Any day that I get to hang out with Diya is a good one. But I would also say really thinking about the internet's architecture, right? So a lot of the Freedom of the Net report really does go to the sort of the content layer and people's experience of sort of trying to live online. And when we think though about also the internet's actual fiber, the cables, the underpinning of it, that is free and interoperable. And when you think about things like AI transformation, you cannot realize any of the beneficial impacts of that emerging technology without a free and interoperable internet globally for all of that to run across. And so what's really interesting to me is that when we see so many countries where we have seen internet freedoms decline, at the same time, we are going to see those countries increasingly needing to protect things like internet access, to be able to run AI systems, to be able to run telehealth programs, to be able to run wide-scale educational programs in rural areas, to be able to run smart tractors. And so I think there is a tension between what those countries that have been restricting internet freedom are going to be wanting in terms of the next transformation, and the way that they have currently been approaching things like connectivity. What I worry about, I would say, is that with the rise of that transformation, we are also seeing a truly significant rise in the concept of digital sovereignty, even though no one has exactly defined what that is in any particular environment. But one of the benefits that the interoperable free internet gave us from a human rights standpoint is that when human rights were being repressed inside of borders, a borderless internet created more opportunity for those rights to be realized in different ways. And as we see a greater focus from governments on being able to control that sort of application layer within their own borders, which I think is a natural outgrowth of governments becoming more familiar with the internet. Frankly, it's not surprising. But the more that narrative of sovereignty and control over systems within your borders hardens, the more difficult it will also be to protect citizens from human rights violations by their governments within those borders when those violations are occurring online. And so I think there are some reasons to be positive in terms of where the future could be heading. I think there's many areas to be concerned. And my hope is that when we have these technological transformation conversations, we aren't ignoring the 15 years of lessons that Freedom House has helped us to learn with this report, and that we instead were centering that knowledge.
Thanks, Kat. And we'll get into those lessons. You've touched on a lot of the themes of this panel that I'm excited to dive into. But before that, Kian, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you, Kat and Diya. These are fantastic remarks to open us off, a sign of more great discussion to come. I think this question brings to mind a really interesting component of our data, which is that we found around the world, more people are becoming connected to the internet, and more people are concerned with the really day-to-day issues of whether the internet is affordable, reliable, and whether they have options to choose from when they're purchasing access to the internet. This is consistent across the world's freest countries and the world's most repressive countries. Now, for these repressive governments, they have an interest in bringing more people online because even in a very closed authoritarian context like Russia or Rwanda, people understand that bringing people online is essential for human flourishing, for successful businesses, for new economies. But I think one important message here is that it's really the global internet that brings those benefits. Access to unrestricted forms of communication and unrestricted access to information enables businesses to operate these sort of global supply chains and empowers people to learn and exchange the sort of information that drives innovation and powers societal change. So, I think at the end of the day, access to the internet is an incredibly important goal for governments, but preserving the free and open internet is the only way to, fully enable those benefits.
Thank you. And thanks to all of our panelists for bringing that into centralizing sort of the economic dimension of this, social, but then also the human rights dimension, which I think is important to have that holistic view. And to Kat, thinking about AI, which I want to get to in a future question. Before I get there, just taking a look at the central finding really from every year of Freedom on the Net, which is this: we're in an age of sustained decline, declining rights of free expression, of privacy, of freedom of association and assembly online. And I wondered, all of you here have been working on these issues for quite a while. With all of your experience, are there particular years or events of the past 15 years that stand out to you as an inflection point? Are there certain actors that you think have had an outsized influence for good or for bad over the past 15 years? Just thinking about the lessons learned that we can then translate into solutions moving forward in a next question. Diya, I'll start with you.
Great. Not a difficult question at all. But I think if I look at maybe the past 15, 20 years of internet, I mean, there's several inflection points that come to mind. But the one that I'm going to focus on is really COVID-19 and the pandemic. Because I think that had the level of global impact and this urgency that while at the same time borderless internet or the interoperable internet was meaningful, it was also important to create certain kinds of guardrails, both online and offline. And I think there's a lot of, beyond just the online, there's a lot of declining of trust that happened during that period between governments and between countries and between, community connection became stronger. In many ways, bilateral relationships and state-to-state relationships, I think, went through some declines because of how the inequities around vaccine distribution, inequities around resourcing came up. And that, I think, led to a lot of momentum around how countries engage with each other on these particular issues. There's a much more sort of greater sort of push towards sovereignty that then went from national sovereignty to digital sovereignty. And then within the countries themselves, we see this accelerated sort of product development around these super apps, right? So, there's the around surveillance, around trying to figure out where people are at. And that sort of journey, that train kind of never really stopped. And that's just within the countries themselves. And then on the flip side, if you see the private sector, again, there was a massive growth, lots of hiring across the corporate sector. But at the same time, there was also outsized, sort of concerns around, what does the datafication look like in that kind of scenario, right? And I think that dependency, there was also a lot of pushback against that dependency on, if suddenly Zoom stopped working, how would we live in this world, right? And so So I think both of those factors in many ways contributed to a reimagination of what the internet could be. And that reimagination was more about how do we preserve our borders, how do we think about sovereignty, and how do we fight the transnational influence of the corporate sector by kind of looking more inward. So I think that, in my mind, is a very powerful inflection point.
Thanks for bringing us back to that nightmare of many years ago. Kat, please.
No, I think COVID-19, especially just in terms of the tension that existed between surveillance of individuals and being able to protect their health and inform them, right? There was just a very real tension between the protections you wanted to give human beings and also the number of states that were essentially spinning up, emergency rationales for requiring everyone to download what is essentially a surveillance app on their device, and then the lack of clarity around what governments were when they were going to turn that off, right? Or when that information would stop being collected. I mean, the other years certainly in our space that always stand out are, of course, sort of 2010 to 2012 with the Arab Spring, right? 2016 with the genocide of the Rohingya, which I think for many Westerners was the first time that people understood how disproportionate these impacts could be in communities that were vulnerable and that were not being effectively monitored by the companies that were operating there. I think you saw the same thing, honestly, in 2022. I think we'll look back on that in terms of the launch of GPT as something that ended up being a transformative moment as well, where I think that's still being shaped, but I have no doubt that we will look back on that in terms of how freedom started shifting and realize that that was the beginning of a seismic shift geopolitically. Certainly the digital sovereignty narrative has picked up so much more steam. In terms of the countries that have had sort of outsized impacts, I would say on the internet governance side, certainly China and Russia have been very aggressive in different ways at trying to counter some of the goals of an interoperable internet and surveilling their own citizens. But I would also say, we would not have the internet that we have. We wouldn't have the internet freedom community that we have. We wouldn't have any of the research. We wouldn't have our understanding of digital rights had it not been for the US government. And the US government was historically a champion for internet freedom globally, both in terms of its multilateral priorities in its foreign policy, but also in terms of its material support for civil society organizations working in these spaces. And the pulling back on that support for civil society globally, I think is going to have seismic and very damaging ramifications. And so there is no country that will be able to step up to fill the role that the US government was. And I don't entirely know what our future looks like with such a changed approach.
Thanks, Kat. And I want to get to that issue as well on the US government freeze. Kian, anything you wanted to add before I please jump in?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered most of the history of the internet over the past 15 years in just 5 minutes. I think I'll add maybe two other inflection points here. The first in 2011 and 2012, the Snowden leaks, which I think really changed public awareness about what bulk communication surveillance looks like. Just the idea that governments could be tapping into the physical infrastructure that powers the internet, as Kat referenced earlier, in order to sift through people's communications and pull out secrets, so to speak. And then a decade later, we saw a steady drip of information coming from technical experts and civil society about mercenary spyware groups. And I think that's another incredibly important inflection point. Again, these revelations pointed to the fact that for relatively little money, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, a government actor or a non-state actor could purchase a tool that allows you to target someone's phone and siphon out all of the information there with very little that they can do to prevent it. And I think these two revelations bookend just how much sensitive information we transact in our day-to-day. Whether intentionally or not, we're sharing so much information about our daily lives with our digital devices. And increasingly, state actors and non-state actors want to tap into that. And so I think this brings back some of the recommendations that Jen outlined early in the presentation. Fundamental data protection rules can work to a certain extent to mitigate this problem. But of course, we also need government action to reform surveillance practices and impose restrictions on these mercenary spyware firms.
Those are some really important, sort of an oral history of internet freedom over the past 15 years or so, maybe a PhD topic one day. I wanted to get, Kat, you actually teed up two questions that I'd like to get into, but I'll start with that role of the US government. So earlier this year, as much of our audience may know, the US government froze and then later terminated much of its foreign assistance programming, including some of the crucial support to technologists, to advocacy organizations, and others who are working to promote and protect human rights online. Freedom House was also impacted in that, for full disclosure. And I wondered, are there, to everybody, please feel free to take this, are there any early insights about the impact of that? How are particularly civil society adapting to these historic cuts around the world? And thinking about also what has been the role that civil society has played in the past that perhaps we want to make sure that they're able to play that again moving forward.
Yeah, I really want to hear your thoughts on this because you're so much closer to the ground than I am.
No, sure, happy to. I think a couple of thoughts. First is, we ran a survey when the first announcements came in earlier this year, and then we did multiple rounds of this to understand what's happening across the digital freedom sector. We primarily work with global majority countries, and therefore all of our research was focused on what is happening to communities there. And I think we found, an immediate sort of impact on specific sort of work streams, for example, around feminist tech, or work looking into gender-based violence, for example, work looking into information ecosystems and information disorder. Lots of training programs that actually helped journalists and human rights defenders on the ground. And so there was a massive cut that was felt immediately right there. But then as the year kind of evolved, we're beginning to also see from grassroots organizations all the way to mid-sized organizations across the global majority who are being disproportionately impacted. And I think something that really caught us, it was a surprise to us, was it wasn't that they all received direct US funding, but sort of the whole network of intermediaries who received funding and then they would then support grassroots effort. That entire sort of process, the entire supply chain is probably not the right word, but that entire sort of chain of supporting each other kind of completely collapsed. So that was like the first most dangerous space to be in. And then the second part of that is really, as we're looking into the future, we are speaking with organizations and our peers across the global majority, and it seems that some of these impacts are being felt a lot more now than they were in the first sort of round of funding freezes. So orgs going into late 2026, early 2027, there is a very serious existential crisis that are we going to continue operating at all? Because we're in a scenario right now where you have a 500-person organization in the human rights space who's competing for the same pool of funds as a grassroots organization with limited sort of infrastructure. And I think that's not a great place ever for civil society to be in. So that's, I guess, in terms of the funding situation, but broadly in terms of civil society's contribution, I think I want to challenge a little bit of a previous comment around sort of the role of Russia and China. And I think while that's very important and critical, and I think they have reshaped how we think about internet freedoms, and particularly now they have a lot of capture in the multilateral space, I do want to get into middle powers that's emerging right now. So for most of the global majority, it isn't just Russia and China. There are several countries across Asia, Africa, and America who have an outsized impact at the regional level. And I think the work of civil society in the last 15 years has really built the foundations to resist that. So civil society isn't, and I think it's sometimes because of how funding is structured and how we understand the world, civil society is oftentimes caught between this US-China tension. But I think for civil society, there's a lot more existential threats happening within their own countries, across their region, And in the last 15 years, we've seen an incredible amount of resilience from civil society to be able to weather this and to be able to continue operating in these environments. I mean, I come from a country, you spoke about Bangladesh, who has had the first positive sort of scoring in like God knows how many years. I think 16 years, I would say. But that wasn't the case even a year ago. I could not imagine working on internet freedoms even a year ago. There are multiple cases against me, multiple sort of threats to go to jail. Our entire team faces massive security risks on the ground. And so kind of living in that scenario and surviving that, and then kind of being sort of further disenfranchised by this funding cuts, it's really says something. So I do think the kind of positive movements that we see, whether that's movements happening in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Gambia, in Kenya, I think a lot of it is perhaps an extension of the foundations that civil society has built in the last many, many years, and has given us a sort of a informed understanding of how we think about our freedoms, our rights, particularly when there is this weird tension between economic rights and human rights. I think that's kind of where civil society has really placed human rights at the center. And I think that's really what's beginning to show as we think about some of these positive movements.
Big Diya really laid that out beautifully. And to just pick up that thread, over the years, we've studied the context where conditions for internet freedom have improved. And we've looked at what exactly is motivating those changes. And in many of these cases, we found that even if it's an improvement motivated by a government passing more progressive policy change or private sector actions to protect human rights, that's often coming on the back of local civil society organizations pushing actors to move the needle to safeguard internet freedom. We found that even under these incredibly repressive conditions, like Diya spoke about in the Bangladeshi context, local civil society organizations can figure out where there are windows for change. Those windows might be, a relatively independent judiciary where courts can assert some muscle to intervene against repressive policy, or a change in government that brings in new leadership that might be open to considering policy changes. Or even strong partnerships with the private sector when companies have an interest in maintaining access to the free and open internet in order to do business in a given jurisdiction. We actually, we spoke about how Kenya saw the largest score decline this year because of the government's restrictions on the internet during protests and a really violent crackdown against people expressing their opinions about economic policy. But there's even, stories there about civil society pushing for positive change. Back in May, a coalition of local Kenyan and East African groups brought a case arguing that the internet shutdown carried out in June 2024 was illegal, that it violated Kenyan law. And they brought in research from censorship monitoring groups, technical experts from around the world who looked at conditions in Kenya around the time of the internet shutdown. These Kenyan civil society groups succeeded in obtaining an injunction from a court that ordered Kenyan internet service providers to maintain access to the internet while the case is being considered. So even in these really concerning contexts, civil society organizations have shown that they're mobile, that they can respond to these negative pressure and find opportunities to assert safeguards for internet freedom.
I would just add, I think those points are so important. And Diya, I absolutely agree with you. I was focused more on internet architecture, right? And the internet governance debate in the background. But I mean, for example, when we think about connectivity shutdowns, I mean, India was the champ for years there in terms of the number of shutdowns that were happening internally. I would just add onto this that one of the concerns that I have moving forward in terms of the diminishing support for local civil society organizations in particular is that they bring very specific expertise that cannot be matched by anyone else in terms of that local context and the way that rights are being either realized or violated in any particular context. And what we have seen over the years, both through companies and then through things like like laws that would come from the European Union, for example, are a mandate of accessing for independent expertise, right? Or wanting to get independent reporting. Well, all of that independent expertise comes primarily from these civil society organizations. And so when you no longer have those independent, non-governmental voices illuminating for you how that context is different and specific, your understanding of how to operate in that environment, what the risks are, what the benefits might be, how the most beneficial uses of your tools could be deployed, that deep local context, the less that civil society has means of support and means of working with each other as well to amplify each other's messages, the harder it is going to be as we see more digitalization at scale for any of the key actors to understand the environment they are actually going into and what the impacts of their scaling technologies may be. And so I struggle because I can't think of a time where it was more critical for us to have strong civil society on the ground. And we do still have strong civil society on the ground. But as Diya pointed out, a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the sort of organizational, I want to say, connectivity, not digital connectivity, but network community connectivity that was coming from a lot of the foreign assistance funding having now diminished. I'm worried that we're at a place where it will be harder and harder for civil society to organize, to collaborate, and to learn from each other at the exact same moment that we're seeing a rise in digital sovereignty narratives and a critical importance in understanding local contexts. And so I can't say strongly enough how important these groups have been to their communities, but also to our broader regional and global understanding of how technological transformation is occurring and what its impacts are.
Some really important points, and we've talked about civil society. We've touched a little bit on the geopolitics, whether that's China and Russia and the middle powers. And I wanted to bring in a third element here, which is the private sector. So actually pulling into some of the audience Q&A that we've received, and I invite others to submit questions. There's a question here from Ian Levine. What is your analysis of how tech companies are responding to the challenges of respecting human rights at a time of declining global internet freedoms? And so within that, I think, we can think about the traditional technology companies. We can also think about the new players in artificial intelligence and satellite, thinking about sort of how we were 15 years ago, how the landscape was. I think it's a very different landscape today. What do you think what are the good things that technology companies are doing? What are the risks that they may face, and what sort of advice might you give to them?
Kian, go for it.
This is a great question. I think one storyline of the past 15 years of internet freedom decline is that we've seen efforts within companies to stand up teams focusing on human rights and focusing on advancing public policy priorities around free expression and privacy. Different companies have taken different approaches, and this has come alongside the growing professionalization of the trust and safety field, the folks who are charged with the sort of everyday work of preventing terrible content from spreading on the platforms, and ideally working to mitigate the sort of circumstances that we saw, for example, in 2016 during the Rohingya genocide, which I think has motivated much of this change. This sort of evidence pattern that in the early 2010s, people use social media platforms to spread hate in Myanmar, and the platform Facebook specifically did not do enough to stop that. And we saw terrible atrocities perpetrated in Myanmar by security forces as a direct result of that online hate. And so I think the companies have worked very hard in some cases and less hard in other cases to work to mitigate that problem. I think when we look at the sort of first wave, the Web 2.0 social media companies, we're also at a moment of inflection. There is pressure to decenter the work of those human rights teams within organizations. And I think it's incredibly important that our partners in the private sector maintain the commitments that they've carved out to ensure that they're working to protect free expression and privacy in their services.
Thanks, Kian. Kat, you had authored a task force report on the scaling trust and safety prior to a lot of the shifts that have happened this year, I believe. But I wonder, just given also your more recent work on artificial intelligence and part of the digitalization and digital transformation, how do you see the stakes for companies today around the world, and how would you rate their performance so far?
I would not want to rate the performance of companies writ large, because I think, as Kian said, it's been very, it's not just company specific, but it is sort of issue specific. So there are areas where some companies have better space to protect certain rights than others, and where they've also, I would argue, been more irresponsible, right, or less responsible than others. I would say the idea that we had in those sweet summer days of like the 2010s, right, that the big digital platforms, the big tech companies were going to be there to change the world, and they were going to do good, and they were going to be on the side of rights. It was a lovely time, and it was also a very naive understanding of how the world would evolve. At the end of the day, the companies, their job is to return long-term value to their investors or to their shareholders. And what we have seen over the years is that when it comes down to a choice of protecting their revenue, protecting growth, especially right now with the AI investments that we're seeing, versus protecting the rights of individual citizens in any particular country, the company is going to choose revenue. And I want to be clear, that is to a large degree their job as well. So we have to acknowledge that. So if we want the companies to incentivize that in different ways, I think we also need to be fighting for different incentive structures that allow them to do that in a business case scenario. Trust and safety has so historically been seen as a cost center, as opposed to a long-term value generator. And the most mature companies tend to understand the long-term value that trust and safety investments can provide, but it depends a lot on what those investments look like. So are you thinking about advanced protection for a human rights defender whose Gmail has been hacked in a sanctioned country? That's one type of thing. But if you think about Google's massive longitudinal investments in encrypted Gmail, in protection of users from cybersecurity attacks and from hacking, of the existence of an advanced security program that, you know, human rights activists can enroll in, I also don't think you can look at the company and say they haven't done anything, right? So it's a mixed bag. One of the challenges that I think I'm seeing right now is that there are so many new entrants into the field, between the sort of the AI centric companies that are much younger and much newer, and also the rise of the satellites and low Earth orbit. And the exact same issues that we have been dealing with for 15 years and that have been addressed ad nauseum with the sort of larger known tech companies and with many of the telcos are, I think, not even being considered by a lot of the new entrants. And I cannot emphasize enough that in this regard, AI will not be new. This will be the exact same thing that we have experienced. And there are so many lessons that we have learned over the years that I hope we get to better pathways to accelerate the incorporation of that knowledge and deep thought, not only into policies, but what will always be more important, which is deep thought into product and the engineering and what it is designed to do and how it's making money, how that product is making money. And once you understand that, then you are in a much better position, I think, to be understanding where a company may or may not move. The last thing that I would add is we've also seen such an increase globally in different governments mandating that there be a local registered official. Some people refer to these as hostage-taking laws. But the idea that data would have to be centralized, servers have to be centralized, that there be a local official or a local office that is registered. In many years of working with companies and serving on the board of the Global Network Initiative, one of the best ways that you can put pressure on a company is to have them have a local office or local employees that you can go after in terms of detention or harassment, because the companies rightfully will always be protective of their employees' safety. And so that can be seen by many as a reasonable demand from governments in terms of wanting to have someone who is accountable locally, but it should also be seen clearly as a way that governments can dramatically shift the influence that they have over digital platforms that would otherwise not have a footprint in the country in ways that can really diminish the space for human rights activists and for human rights protections.
Thanks, Kat. That's a really important deep dive into different perspectives about really understanding this issue, also from the corporate perspective or from the reality perspective, which I think is really important in terms of then informing change. Diya, I wanted to bring you in on this if you had any thoughts, because this is in some ways part of the mission of Tech Global Institute is seeking that engagement with the private sector. And so thinking about your long experience on this issue, plus you were to work inside a tech company working on public policy issues. And so have you seen, part of what I think Kian and Kat have talked about is a narrative that has either changed or gone up and down over the years? And then also, has the landscape changed in terms of the types of players that are there, what their interests are?
Yeah, thanks. I think both Ken and Kat did an excellent job in kind of laying the land. But maybe I just want to just add on to that in the sense that I think for companies, oftentimes human rights, trust and safety, sort of investing in the resourcing, particularly across the global majority, seems like a cost center. But as we are beginning to see around the world, particularly with the rise of middle powers, that increasingly, the very architecture on which companies stand is being threatened. So I think it's important to remind the companies that, yes, you have a fiduciary responsibility, but you're not going to exist if the internet starts breaking up. And that I think is a natural incentive then for the private sector to start reinvesting in some of these areas where we've seen declining investments. And I think the other element of that is, and I think Kat kind of alluded to it, is that this arc of, we see, every 20 years, I think we reach an inflection point in the technology arc. And we have the exact same conversations all over again, which I find quite equally frustrating and fascinating. Because if you think about some of the cases that happened back in the 90s, against Microsoft, and talk about antitrust, and then again we had those similar conversations about Google, which is in the last couple of years in Europe, and now we're having those similar conversations about sort of what does governance mean, what does safety guardrails mean, what does sort of a responsible tech look like as far as AI is concerned. And I think the fact that we're not reflecting on the last 20 years of what has happened in this space, and when we think about governance for the future, and the fact that we, many stakeholders in this space are positioning this as a new problem, I think is deeply concerning, because we have so much lessons to actually learn from and kind of implement in this space. And I think it's even more it's even more interesting that many of the newer players in this space are positioned as that they have a different tech, therefore there needs to be a different governance mechanism, or they have a different equity at stake, or there's a different company structure, as we see for some of the newer private sector players. But fundamentally, the basic tenets of what does good governance look like, what does a good democracy look like, which is where you have good data governance laws, fundamental rights that's enshrined in the Constitution, and then strong consumer protection sort of mechanisms and competition authorities. Like, those four pillars should exist regardless of the kind of tech that's coming and regardless of the kind of players that's coming into the space. So I think there's a real opportunity or a real need for us to recenter our focus on what we know, what already exists in many of our economies. I mean, I speak with governments around the world who say that they are constrained because they cannot create a new AI authority. And I always say, why do you need a new AI authority? You already have a consumer protection authority. You already have a data governance authority. You already have a competition authority. You already have the pillars. It's only about building that capacity and then thinking about how do we sort of address every new tech that comes along, rather than feeling defeated and frustrated on that front. And then at the same time, it's also, and it's also in the interest of investments, both in terms of the company's growth as well as that of the country, that we maintain an open and interoperable internet, because otherwise, this sort of breaking of the internet, this sort of larger sovereignty play is likely to risk not just economic opportunities, but also broader national security of these various jurisdictions. So I hope that there's a little bit more alignment on what all of us sees as very obvious and clear, but seems to be oftentimes missing in many of these conversations.
Thanks for that. It's a really important point, and thinking about, as much as things change, things also stay the same, and there's already an infrastructure for dealing with some of these challenges. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think that's an important point to make. We have about 7 minutes left. I wanted to get to one last question in the Q&A, and then I'll just leave us with one last question after that. So there's a question from Chiara Castro. Kian, I know that you've done some research on this recently, so maybe this is for you first. Have you recorded an increase in attacks against circumvention technologies like VPNs this year? What are the risks, and what can be done now that some democracies are also considering limiting VPN usage?
The great question, and it's something we've watched with concern. So to maybe just level set for folks who are less familiar, circumvention tools like virtual private networks enable people to get around the sort of website blocking and filtering that is really common as a tool of censorship in countries around the world. And so governments in repressive countries may have an interest in restricting the operation of VPN companies and other circumvention technology tools because they want their censorship to be effective. So Freedom House wrote a report back in June with the European University Institute, and we looked at restrictions on censorship circumvention tools. We found that in the 72 Freedom on the Net countries, authorities in 21 had sought to block access to VPNs or censorship circumvention tools within the past 5 years. So when we talk about block, we mean that their websites were restricted. People can't download, VPNs in a country like Russia, which seeks to enforce really strong restrictions on the global internet. But we also found an array of other measures that make it harder for censorship circumvention tools to operate in a way that preserves the security and privacy of their users. So in India, for example, the country's cybersecurity authority put rules in place that require VPN companies and cloud storage providers to localize data, to store their data locally for Indian users, and hand over certain identifying information to authorities on request. That's a problem because for many people in India, these VPNs are a way of accessing information that the government seeks to repress. And requiring these companies to hand over user data creates new risks that people might be facing arrest or other legal repercussions for accessing censorship information. There's also a new trend, unfortunately, in Western Europe, and I think the commenter may be alluding to this, where in the name of preserving copyright law, authorities impose obligations on VPN providers to carry out website blocks. So in countries like Italy and France, where authorities have gone after illegal piracy streaming websites, usually it's related to football, to soccer. The authorities have sought to compel VPN providers to carry out censorship orders. And that opens a really dangerous door because while certainly authorities have an interest in enforcing copyright laws and local laws against piracy, once you start ordering certain providers to censor online content, that unfortunately opens the door to the censorship of other legitimate forms of expression, like discussion about politics and other social issues.
Thanks for going into that and answering that question, Kian. I wanted to, we have a few minutes left, end on a more forward-looking note. And so I'll invite both of you, Kat and Diya, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, is there one moonshot regulatory change or tech innovation that you believe could meaningfully reverse the trajectory of declining internet freedom globally? So a little bit of a thought-provoking futurism question.
I can try taking a first stab at that. But I mean, it's really hard to focus on just one, Adrian, just because, and I feel that this ecosystem, and particularly in where we are right now, geopolitically, technically, in the multilateral space, our declining trust in institutions, whether that's domestically, regionally, or globally, I think we definitely need sort of an entire overhaul of how we think about our relationships with each other, with the state, and with sort of the entire neoliberal architecture. But I'm not going to keep that. I'm not going to focus on the philosophical debate right now. But if there was one sort of governance or moonshot regulatory change, I think the one that I think that's going to make the most difference is stronger and more meaningful data governance frameworks, particularly ones that really centralize. And I think we need to move a bit away from data protection to really sort of data rights or privacy as a framework. And I think there's been a bit of shift in the last couple of years in how we frame our sort of relationship with data, how we are thinking about who sort of our rights over our data. So I think there really needs to be a fundamental shift in how we govern data, what kind of sort of rights we as users have over our data, how is that being used, and not just in terms of that piece, but also really thinking through what have we learned from other sectors like health care, for example, when it comes to sort of data access, data confidentiality, data sensitivity, as well as a collective data governance. I think oftentimes we get tied into the individual rights of our data, but if you go into sort of the lessons from indigenous communities for many, many decades, since the beginning of time, it's really about how we think about data stewardship as a community. And I think there's lots of value in being able to bring back some of those lessons. And I think that will fundamentally shift how we think about our relationship with technology if you're able to start thinking about data governance in a more meaningful, holistic, and inclusive way.
That's really important. Kat, please.
I mean, in general, I don't tend to think of these as, to me, these are societal problems with a technological tool set underpinning them, as opposed to things that can be solved with a technical solution. But I would say seeing much more aggressive efforts, especially in the United States, to go after the data broker market and data broker economy, I think could be very important. There are a lot of great beneficial uses of people's data. And when the primary use is just to sell it, it raises so many concerns, not just around privacy, but about the incentives that are driving that. So I think really having some fundamental reconsiderations of why data is being collected, what it is being for, like what it's being used for, and what's societally allowable, I think is extremely important. I also think that we are going to see the virtue of everyone sort of claiming that things are new because AI means that there is an opening to have debates again and to have conversations again where, there is a lot of PTSD from unresolved fights that is now being refought in the AI landscape. But that also means that there's an opening and an opportunity to have a refreshed conversation with people who have evolved and who have a different understanding of the landscape and a more sophisticated understanding of how things roll out. And so when we think about things like authenticity protocols like C2PA in AI, we didn't really touch on how much information manipulation is also showing up in the report. Having an authenticity protocol is not going to immediately allow you to know whether something is real. But if you have baked into technical standards across platforms all over the world that which was generated is not real, and that's easy to see, we dramatically shrink the universe of things where we have to have that debate or that discussion, and that's important. So I do think that there are going to be some interesting technical longitudinal solutions that come out that can help address some of these issues. But going after the scam centers, going after fraud, going after ransomware, going after spyware, going after the data brokering economy, these are all things that I think would play a meaningful role in building more trust in our digital ecosystems and making them better fit for purpose for societal uses.
We have our marching orders. Thank you both. Thank you, Kian, as well. I'm going to have to wrap us up. We could chat about these for another hour, but unfortunately, we have to close. So I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Kat, Diya, Kian. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I also want to thank our generous donors who made all of this possible: the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Dutch Postcode Lottery, Google, Internet Society Foundation, the New York Community Trust, and Proton, as well as those who provide general support to Freedom House. And thank you to everybody at Freedom House who played a role in producing this incredible report. A special shout out to Ali Funk, who's been on maternity leave after welcoming a beautiful baby boy. We wish her the best in her next chapter. And thank you, the listener, for being with us. As you've heard today, collectively, our engagement and your engagement on these issues is critical to creating a world where we are all more free. And so we wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.